Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, it is always an honor for me to take the floor before this Court to support Armenia. I would like to come back to three factual realities that are decisive in this case, including for the indication of the 10th and last provisional measure requested by Armenia. Madam President, the first factual reality that we should bear in mind is that the refugees of Nagorno-Karabakh are indeed victims of ethnic cleansing. Whether Azerbaijan likes it or not, there are no other words to describe what has just occurred. Azerbaijan will tell you that Armenian residents of Nagorno-Karabakh left of their own accord, and this fable is indeed untenable. Even President Aliyev realizes this. That is the reason why he invented another tale, in keeping with his usual practice of blaming someone else. He now contends that, and I quote from a press release of the President's office on the 7th of October of this year, he said
that had forced Armenians to leave the territory.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, in this tale in which the executioner accuses his victim of being responsible for his own suffering, is abject, to say the very least. But it is likely that you will have to endure this storytelling session later today. Fortunately, as Professor Murphy has just explained, the Court will not be required to rule on its merits. However, this reality simply cannot be ignored at this stage of provisional measures. The second reality that one must bear in mind is equally obvious. Azerbaijan is doing its utmost to make sure that the current situation persists. That is to say that it is attempting to consolidate its ethnic cleansing plans. The day after the massive attack on 19th of September, President Aliyev claimed
its sovereignty.
At the very same moment, the inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh were fleeing from the region, and President Aliyev was boasting about their freedom to leave. And since then, just as in 2020, Azerbaijan has started executing its Great Return program. This is deeply shocking. During an initial census in 1886, the population of Nagorno-Karabakh was made up of 85% of ethnic Armenians. When the Soviet Oblast was created, this figure stood at 89%. At the end of the Soviet era, there was still 77% of ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And as you know, today, just a handful of them remain. When applied to Nagorno-Karabakh, the so-called Great Return of Azerbaijanis is purely and simply a racist project aimed at exclusion and which is counter to the convention. Its aim is to replace uprooted ethnic Armenians from their homeland, where they have always been in the majority, with Azerbaijanis. The only thing Azerbaijan wishes is that the Court should not come in the way of the consolidation of its great discriminatory project conducted under the guise of territorial sovereignty. This project not only requires ethnic cleansing that the world has just witnessed, but also the denial and erasure of symbols of Armenian heritage in cities, villages, monuments, churches, and of all Armenian cultural artifacts. Distinguished members of the Court, do you truly believe that destroying a monument in Shushi commemorating the 1915 Armenian genocide and replacing it with the Azerbaijani flag immediately after the purported liberation of the city was just an example of very bad taste? Do you truly believe that what happened in Shushi at the beginning of 2021, and I had provided you with the facts of this during the first provisional measures request of Armenia, do you really believe that this is exceptional or random and will not occur ever again elsewhere in Nagorno-Karabakh, whereas the Baku regime flatly denies the existence of the Armenian genocide? Do you believe that more recently the fact that the giant cross overlooking Stepanakert was pulled down and the fact that military forces opened fire on a 13th century Armenian monastery was simply due to the unfortunate cultural insensitivity of inebriated soldiers celebrating victory? Do you think that when the Ministry of Culture of Azerbaijan claimed on 4th of October that the Ganjazar monastery was founded in the 13th century by Albanian Caucasians and then falsified by Armenians during their occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh, do you think that this was simply an archaeological error made by a young intern? Of course not. This is not just fortuitous. This is not just a blunder. All this was clearly calculated, carefully thought through, and meticulously and progressively orchestrated with the sole purpose of consolidating ethnic cleansing plans in Nagorno-Karabakh and making it clear to Armenians once and for all that they were unwelcome there. President Aliyev's diplomatic advisor recently claimed, and I quote,
C'est sur votre écran. We are deliberately refraining from putting up Azerbaijani flags. We know that there are still civilians and we know their fears.
Isn't that a wonderful testament to the fact that ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh indeed fear Azerbaijanis, including those who have remained there? But that is not it. This admission contains a lie, as the footage on the screen shows. Since the 19th of September, Azerbaijan adores placing its flag in Nagorno-Karabakh. And there's more still. In a letter addressed to the European Court of Human Rights on the 2nd of October that we have submitted as Appendix 140, and knowing that the presidential advisor was talking nonsense, Azerbaijan amended its statement, even while quoting it, so as to restrict its scope, or even at least attempt to restrict its scope in Stepanakert. That was renamed Chekindi. Not only did Azerbaijan try to deceive the court in Strasbourg, but it lied once again because, as you can see on the screen, Azerbaijan's flag was even placed on the most symbolic monument of the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh. Distinguished members of the court, the protection of the rights enshrined in the convention requires that Armenian heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh be preserved, and Armenia requests the court to ensure the legal conditions for the safe return of ethnic Armenians to their ancestral homeland. These conditions are set out in the provisional measures that Professor Murphy detailed.
Être particulièrement
Armenia believes that it is particularly well placed to understand the need for security of the traumatized refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh and to know what measures are necessary to ensure their effective return. In this respect, the measures requested are also intended to anticipate all the tricks Azerbaijan is capable of pulling to prevent this return, including the pretext that the refugees' identity or property titles are non-existent since they were issued by the authorities of the so-called regime that Azerbaijan considers illegal, and that consequently, in the absence of a valid proof, the said refugees have no right to return to their homes. I would also like to remind you that, as the recent past has taught us, any measure requested by Armenia that you do not indicate will be celebrated by Azerbaijan as a go-ahead from your part. Azerbaijan would read your order as a alleged rejection of such and such Armenian requests, and therefore as an encouragement to do what the measure was intended to avoid, even though the measure actually ordered by the court, read and executed in good faith, necessarily but not implicitly prohibits the same conduct. Thus, if you indicate ambiguous measures whose loopholes Baku will exploit, ethnic cleansing will come to pass. Furthermore, distinguished members of the court, if you wait until you've ruled on the merits to thwart the ongoing plans of ethnic cleansing on the pretext that this is a request for restitution, which our opponents might argue through legal subterfuge, it will be too late. Madam President, I'm coming to the third factual reality that must be borne in mind when ruling. It concerns the promises and assurances presented by Azerbaijan in an attempt to convince you that there is no need to indicate provisional measures. The first reason why Azerbaijan cannot be taken at its word is that its word alone is incapable of ensuring the return of traumatized refugees in Nagorno-Karabakh. If you think that this word is enough, you will have made an unfortunate contribution to President Aliyev's great work. The second reason why Azerbaijan's word cannot be trusted is because its word is totally inadequate and that what it says does not really commit it to anything. Let's take a closer look at Azerbaijan's so-called commitments. Do they concern the safety of Armenian political prisoners and the few dozen Armenians who remain in Nagorno-Karabakh? Not a word. Do they concern the preservation of the Armenian character of Nagorno-Karabakh? Not a word on this issue. Does Azerbaijan promise not to flood Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijans? Not a word in this regard. On the contrary, the hastening of the Great Return has been announced. Finally, with regard to the return of this time of Armenian refugees, Azerbaijan wrote in the following letter to you on the 2nd of October.
That Armenian residents of Karabakh who decide to leave will have a right to return to Karabakh. Les mots employés.
The words used and the conjugation of the verbs in the sentence are obviously important on the 2nd of October when Nagorno-Karabakh was almost emptied of its inhabitants. Azerbaijan claims to guarantee that the few Armenian residents of Karabakh who decided to leave their homeland will have a right to return. There's all there is to it. Is this an unconditional and secure guarantee of the right to return for all those who fled their homes on the 19th of September? Not at all. And Azerbaijan is well aware of this, as it never chooses its words at random. Similarly, the reintegration procedure proposed for the Armenian residents of Nagorno-Karabakh, which
in the Karabakh region. Azerbaijan
they say that this maintains that this registration procedure is purely voluntary, but the document it has submitted to you indicate that this registration is.
Et puis ça veut dire.
And what does that mean? Reintegration of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh who are still there, and above all, how does this registration procedure with a view to reintegration enables the return of refugees who are now in Armenia, or the protection of rights, particularly property titles of those who decide not to return? In particular, the 9th protective measure requested by Armenia is in no way superseded by this registration procedure. In fact, after presenting the registration as voluntary, Azerbaijan would have no problem considering unregistered places of residence and property titles as voluntarily abandoned, and therefore at the disposal of the Azerbaijanis. Whatever is said, all will be said to you later. Azerbaijan cannot be taken at its word. With regard to this dispute, one only needs to recall the many statements made to you by the agent of Azerbaijan, which was contradicted by facts, as the agent of Armenia recalled at the beginning of the hearing. Moreover, you have considered Azerbaijani statements made at this hearing to be insufficient to completely eliminate the risk of irreparable harm. The same is even more true here. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, all this leads Armenia to ask you to order the 10th provisional measure requested as well, namely to require Azerbaijan to report regularly on the implementation of your future order. And of course, Armenia is well aware that in December 2021, you considered such a request was not justified in the particular circumstances of the case. Since then, however, Azerbaijan as you know, on several occasions, has defied your authority. And may I remind you that it considers that your order of 6 July validated its checkpoint, closing the Latrine corridor, which is quite incredible. Above all, since then, the particular circumstances of the case have completely changed. Madam President, if you wish to reassure the Armenian men and women who fled their homelands, you must require Azerbaijan, pursuant to Rule 78 of the Rules of Procedure, to report regularly to you on the implementation of your future order. In the same way, it required Myanmar to do so. The gravity of the situation, what is at stake in your future order, and the preservation of your authority require this. Moreover, Armenia, as you know, has been obliged to alert the court every time Azerbaijan has taken initiatives contrary to its international obligations, and this has led to bitter exchanges that have worn out Armenia, and no doubt the court, we therefore believe that such a measure will also contribute to the proper administration of justice. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, thank you for your attention. May I ask you, Madam President, to kindly invite the agent of Armenia, Dr. Karasko, to present his country's final submissions.